Have you ever looked around at people today and thought, what is going on here?
We photograph our food before we eat it. We post the vacation, the kitchen renovation, the birthday dinner, not to remember it, but to show it. There's a photograph from 60 years ago where nobody did any of that. Look at it long enough and something starts to feel strange. Not the haircuts, not the cars in the background, not the clothes. Nobody in the picture is performing a version of themselves they can't afford. The house behind them is whatever size it was. The car is theirs, fully theirs. The clothes will be worn again next week. Somebody hit the button on the Kodak. Everyone squinted in the sun, and that was it. They were exactly who they were. This episode is about why nobody in that photograph needed to perform when that changed, and what it cost us when it did. The word I keep coming back to is alignment, not happiness, not simplicity, not some easier time we've romanticized past the point of recognition. Just alignment between what people had and how they carried themselves. The average American salary in 1960 was around $7,000 a year. That number doesn't sound like much, but here's what it bought: a modest ranch house in a tidy suburb, a car payment you could make, a vacation in August. The kids had what they needed. The account wasn't overflowing, but it wasn't pretending either. One income, one household, the math added up. And when the math adds up, something happens that's easy to miss. You stop having to explain yourself. The house is whatever size the house is. You don't stage the shot to minimize the driveway. The job is the job. You say what it is, and that's the whole sentence. You're not framing it as a stepping stone to something else or softening the title so it sounds like more than it is. You're a machinist, a teacher, a guy who runs the hardware store on Elm Street. That's what you are, and that's enough. If you wanted a new refrigerator, a real one, a General Electric or a Maytag, you went to the store, picked it out, and put it on layaway. You made payments month by month. When the last dollar was paid, they called you and you brought it home. Parents pointed to those appliances like they were trophies, and in a way they were. Not because appliances are worth celebrating, because the thing in your kitchen was unambiguously, completely yours. No interest rate attached to it. No monthly reminder of what you still owed. Yours. There was a word for that feeling: pride. Not the showy kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience. What all of this had in common, the salary, the layaway, the house that was exactly whatever size it was, is that none of it required a story you told yourself. You didn't need to explain the gap between the life you were living and the life you were supposed to be living, because there wasn't much of a gap to explain. That's what alignment looks like. What you had and what you were stayed in the same sentence. Most of us are running a different equation now. The gap between the life and the appearance of the life has to be actively managed, framed, explained, presented in the best possible light. The job isn't just the job. It's a chapter in a larger story. The house is a work in progress, a renovation away from what it's going to be. Nothing quite gets to just be what it is. That gap between what the life actually is and what it has to look like is what this whole episode is about. And by the end, you'll understand exactly when it opened and why it never quite closed. There's a specific thing that happens when work is what you are rather than what you do while waiting for something else. You introduce yourself differently. You carry yourself differently. The job isn't a placeholder, it's the description. On the factory floor, you made something. That sounds obvious. Sit with it for a second. At the end of a shift, there was a thing that existed that hadn't existed that morning. A car door, a refrigerator coil, a steel beam heading to a building somewhere. You could see it, touch it, watch it leave the floor. The shift whistle had a sound that meant something. Not just that the day was over, but that the day was complete. You clocked out and went home as yourself. The work didn't follow you. It stayed on the floor because it was finished, and finished was a thing work could be. A factory job in 1960 wasn't glamorous, and nobody pretended it was. But it paid a wage you could build a life on. It came with a pension you could count on. And it gave you something harder to come by than people realize. A clear answer to the question of what you did all day. I work at the plant. Full sentence, no footnotes. The carpenter built the suburbs, not as a metaphor, literally. The ranch houses, the split levels, the schools, the churches, the hardware stores. Someone framed them. Someone ran the wire. Someone laid the floor. That someone drove a truck with tools in the back and knew by sound whether a board was green or seasoned, by eye whether a wall was plumb before he put a level on it. The evidence of his work didn't go anywhere. You could drive past it decades later and point to a house on a street and say, "I built that," and the house would still be standing there agreeing with you. There's a kind of confidence that comes from work that leaves a permanent mark on the physical world. Not arrogance, just the ease of a man who knew exactly what he was good at, why it mattered, and that the proof was right there on the street if anyone cared to look. The secretary ran the office, not in title, in fact. She knew the boss's schedule before he did. She knew which clients needed handling carefully and which calls could wait. She took shorthand at 120 words a minute, typed clean correspondence, routed the mail, managed the filing system that was the company's entire institutional memory, and kept the whole operation moving without anyone formally acknowledging that's what she was doing. The work was real. The skill was real. The alignment, knowing what you were, knowing what the day required, that was real too. A good secretary in 1960 carried herself with the same quiet certainty as the factory worker or the carpenter, but the ceiling was decided in advance. She could be excellent, indispensable, the person the whole office depended on, and the ceiling didn't move. The alignment was real. What it was worth and what it could become was not hers to determine. That wasn't personal. It was structural, built into the architecture of the working world. We'll see the evidence of it shortly. What the factory floor, the job site, and the office all had in common is something simple that's easy to underestimate. The work was visible. You could point to what you'd done. There was a before and an after, and the distance between them was measurable. When you clocked out, the day had a shape. Most of us can't say that now. What we made today lives in an inbox, a Slack thread, a document that got revised 4 times and then filed somewhere. There's nothing to drive past. Nobody outside the office knows whether you worked hard or coasted, and some days, neither do you. That invisibility sets up the performance layer almost by accident. When the work can't speak for itself, you have to speak for it. And once you start speaking for the work, it's a short distance to speaking for the life. None of what we've been talking about, the alignment, the visible work, the clear identity, none of it happened in isolation. It happened somewhere, and the somewhere mattered. You went to the school on your street. Not the school with the best test scores, not the school your parents researched and applied to. The school on your street. That was the whole process. The kid with patched knees and the kid with new shoes sat 2 rows apart and learned the same things from the same teacher who didn't particularly care whose father worked where. The classroom didn't sort by income because it couldn't. Everyone just showed up, and showing up was the only requirement. Those schools weren't perfect, but they were genuinely common ground in the most literal sense. The whole neighborhood's kids in the same building every day. That's not a small thing to lose. You didn't need to be anybody to sit at the counter. A couple of dollars got you a meal and as much coffee as you wanted, and after your first visit, the waitress remembered your usual without being asked. Grilled cheese, side of pickles, chocolate malt. She called you Hon. She refilled your water before you noticed it was low. That counter had a democracy to it. The mechanic and the insurance man sat 3 stools apart, and neither of them thought much about it. The food was the same. The coffee was the same. The check was the same. You weren't a customer with a loyalty profile. You were just a regular. And being a regular meant the place already knew you, and you already knew the place. And that was a relationship that cost nothing and gave something back every time you walked through the door. These places worked because they required nothing of you except showing up. No performance, no quietly signaling through your clothes or your address that you were doing well enough to be there. The commons we have now are different. The feed, the group chat, the comment section. They meet the same human need, the need to be seen and recognized by people around you. But they're engineered for performance in a way the diner counter never was. The algorithm doesn't reward you for showing up. It rewards you for what you post. And what you post is, almost inevitably, almost by design, a version of yourself that's been arranged. The alignment was real. The visible work was real. The commons were real. And the system that made all of it possible had walls built into it. The clearest evidence wasn't subtle. It was printed in the newspaper every morning. Help Wanted ads in the 1960s came in 2 sections. Help Wanted, male. Engineer, manager, supervisor, sales rep. The jobs that led somewhere. Help Wanted, female. Secretary, receptionist, telephone operator, file clerk. The jobs that stayed where they were. Nobody questioned the arrangement. It wasn't hidden or apologized for. It was just the structure, laid out in 2 columns every day in every city in America. If you were a woman who wanted to cross that line, the want ads made clear that the line wasn't accidental. It had been put there on purpose. A woman could be exceptional at her work, the best in the office, the person the whole operation depended on, and the 2 columns would still be waiting for her in the morning paper. Her alignment was real. What the system decided her alignment was worth was a different matter entirely. And it wasn't only women. The commons we talked about, the school on your street, the diner counter, those were real. But they weren't equally real for everyone. For Black Americans in 1960, those commons came with asterisks that white Americans mostly didn't have to think about. Which schools, which counters, which towns where you could stop for gas without something going wrong. The lunch counter wasn't just a place to eat. It was a civil rights battleground, because the right to simply show up somewhere and be served without explanation, without performance, without fear, that right was being actively denied and actively fought for at the exact same moment this episode is describing. That's not a footnote. It belongs in the main text. So here's where this episode stands, and it's worth saying plainly. The alignment was real. The visible work was real. The commons were real. And the system that made them possible had walls built into it. Walls that decided in advance whose alignment the culture was willing to recognize and whose it wasn't. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. The point of this episode isn't to say the 1960s were fair. It's to say there was one specific quality, the alignment, the absence of performance, that's genuinely different now. And the loss of it cost something real, even accounting for everything that was wrong with the world it lived inside. We're not going back, but it's worth understanding what changed, and when, and why. Something changed, not all at once, not on a specific date you could circle on a calendar, but somewhere in the decades after everything we've been describing, a layer of performance got inserted between what people had and how they presented themselves. And once it was in, it was hard to see where it ended and where the actual life began. It started with the economics. In 1960, the median home cost around $11,900. In today's money, that's roughly $129,000. The median new home now sits closer to $420,000, and that's before insurance, property taxes, and the cost of everything else that's climbed alongside it. Back then, one income could usually cover the mortgage. Today, it often takes two steady incomes just to make the monthly payment. And two incomes still leave the account thin at the end of the month. That's a financial fact, but it's also an identity fact. Because when one income was enough, you could be what you were. The job was the job. The house was the house. The math added up, and you didn't carry a gap around with you because there wasn't much of a gap to carry. When two incomes still leave you stretched, when the life costs more than the income that's supposed to support it, something shifts. You're not just managing money anymore. You're managing a story. The story of why the life looks the way it does, why you're further along than the numbers suggest or not, as far as you'd hoped. You're not sure what you are anymore, so you start to perform it. The vocabulary changed along with the economics, and it's worth paying attention to because it's where the performance entered the language before it entered the life. The factory worker became someone in manufacturing. The welder became someone in the trades. The person who got laid off became someone exploring new opportunities. The receptionist became an administrative professional. The used car salesman became a pre-owned vehicle sales consultant. None of those reframings are dishonest exactly, but none of them are the plain thing either. They're the plain thing with a story wrapped around it, a slight softening, a slight elevation, a small hedge against how the title might land in a room full of strangers. That hedge is the performance layer in miniature. And once it entered the language, it became harder to speak without it. For most of American history, if you didn't have the money, you didn't have the thing. Layaway was the bridge. You waited, you paid, you earned it. That system kept the life and the appearance of the life roughly in the same place because you simply couldn't spend what you didn't have. Then revolving credit hit the mainstream. Diners Club in 1950. Bank AmeriCard, the card that would become Visa, in 1958. By the mid-1960s, the credit card was on its way to becoming a fixture of middle-class life. And with it came something new. For the first time in American history, ordinary people could finance the appearance of a life slightly ahead of the one they were actually living. You didn't have to wait. You didn't have to put it on layaway and bring it home only when the last dollar was paid. You could have it now and sort out the math in January, and the gap between what the life cost and what the income could cover, became something you could quietly carry forward. Which brings us to the photograph you took of your dinner, or the LinkedIn post announcing your exciting new chapter, or the vacation photos that hit the feed 2 days before you flew home, or the kitchen renovation that's on its third credit card, or the lease on a car you've never technically owned. None of these are dishonest. That's what makes them worth looking at carefully. Every one of them is a reasonable response to real circumstances. You photograph the meal because it's good and the moment feels worth marking. You post the promotion because you worked hard for it. You book the vacation because you need a break and you deserve one. But take a step back and look at what they share. Every one of them is a performance of the life, a presentation of it, arranged for an audience, pushed into the feed before it's been fully lived. The factory worker didn't post his shift. The carpenter didn't photograph the framing before the walls went up. The secretary didn't announce her accomplishments to a network of people she'd met twice. Not because they lacked pride, they had plenty of it, but because the proof was right there in the world, visible and permanent. It didn't need a caption. Now the work is invisible. The math doesn't add up. And the credit card bridges the gap between the life you're living and the life the feed is showing. And when the gap gets wide enough, when 2 incomes still leave you behind, when the house costs 4 times what your parents paid, when the pension is gone and the retirement account feels abstract, people go looking for a cause. That's where the generational argument comes in. Boomers had it easy. The system was built for them. They pulled up the ladder, and there's real evidence behind that frustration. The math genuinely changed, and someone benefited from the arrangement before the term shifted. But the blame is also a performance of its own. It's the performance of someone who sees the game as rigged and needs the world to know they see it, which is a very human response to an unsustainable gap. And it still doesn't close it. Nobody designed the performance layer. It assembled itself. Out of invisible work, out of a math that stopped adding up, out of cheap credit that made the gap financeable. The result is what most of us live inside now, a continuous low-grade performance, exhausting in a way that's hard to name, because the thing you're performing is your own life. Go back to that photograph, the one in front of the car, the modest house behind them, Sunday clothes, hair combed, everybody squinting into the sun. Somebody hit the button on the Kodak, and then it was done. Nobody staged it. Nobody chose the location because it suggested a life slightly better than the one they were actually living. They stood in front of the car because it was theirs, and that was reason enough. What you had and what you were stayed in the same sentence. That's what we've been circling the whole episode. Not that life was easier then. It wasn't always. Not that the system was fair. We covered that. But there was an alignment between what people had and how they carried themselves that most of us have lost. Gradually enough that most people never got to say goodbye to it. The performance layer that replaced it isn't anybody's fault. It assembled itself out of real pressures and reasonable choices, and By the time most people noticed it was there, it had already become invisible, just the texture of modern life, the way things are now. But invisible doesn't mean free. The performance costs something every day, and it's easier to carry when you can at least see it clearly. The alignment existed. It cost something to lose it, and the first step toward carrying that more honestly is knowing what you're actually carrying. They stood in front of the car because that was the proudest backdrop they had. It was enough. It was exactly enough. If you like this one, there's plenty more of back then left to explore. I'll leave the next one right here. See you soon.